We are in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and we're starting at verse 6. And we're going to spend a little time in verse 6. You may say there's not that much in verse 6, but hey, I got a whole page on verse 6. But the good news is the other page goes a couple chapters. See?
I'm sorry to ask this question
Please.
now, but we're talking about Jabez?
Jabez, the prayer of Jabez.
Jabez. They had the two verses there in the middle of the begats and all that kind of stuff, but was he, I didn't see his name as being a father or a son, so.
I didn't see him anywhere in the begats. I didn't see his name anywhere except in that one section, and he's mentioned one time in 1 Chronicles 2. I thought the same thing, and I did a search on I had my phone with me on Bible, and so I did a search, it has like a concordance search thing, and I looked for Jabez, and there did come up another passage in Chronicles, and it talked about the land of Jabez, that some people went and settled in the land of Jabez. So I don't know that much about Jabez. I've heard there's a whole book on his prayer, I think, that people have read. This morning, for those listening, Linda Williamson's watching. Hi, Linda. Good to see you. Or I don't see you, but I'm sure you're there. The Prayer of Jabez is a book that you can get. It's supposed to be really good. I've heard good things about it. But I've not really studied that historically. I'm wondering if, because like Pastor said, he probably was nobody. And he was probably nobody in the sense he probably wasn't the oldest son of whoever, because why else would they insert him in his prayer right there? And he must have ended up being pretty prominent because there is a land of Jabez that it refers to that people settled in. So he must have gained some prominence in life, but perhaps because he wasn't part of anybody's radar as far as being the oldest son, because when it goes through those names, there were a lot of kids in some of those families, and some of the more important families, they'll list several of the sons, but sometimes they just list the eldest son, from the father to the eldest son to the eldest son, and other times they'll list all the family. So I don't know. That would be curious to know. Good question, Eve. Maybe.
I was going to say, or was his mom maybe a victim of a crime and he's the result?
Potentially. We really don't know. Well, we potentially don't know. We just don't. And Linda's husband, if he's watching today, you need to go tell us, look that up and find out for us, because he's big into that history. He probably can find out or let us know. But if anybody finds out, let us know. If I have time, I'm not going to promise that because I have too much to do. I still have to choose the Christmas program in July. And I haven't had 2 minutes to rub together in June so far, so.
It's a Christmas program yet.
I know. Usually I'm at least scoping them out. But it doesn't help to start too early because they don't even release the new ones until starting in July. So I'm holding back. Don't start. And then when I do it, though, I got to really sit down and do it.
That's a lot of work.
What?
Those guys those guys that put those together, that's got to be a lot of work.
Yeah. So we're starting in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 in verse 6. And let's read. Yes, Vern.
Because not only do they have to get all the music written out and everything, they've got to get the musicians together and actually record it too. Right.
I think they work 2 years ahead. I think it takes a full year for the production portion. It takes a year for them to create it, and then a year for the production. And some of them do it every year. Every year there's certain people that will produce a Christmas program. Yeah. And when you look at those, they reuse some of their songs and some of their stuff too. They remake it. So that's their business. And some of them are pretty good at it.
Pretty good.
So we're in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, starting at verse 6. Your boasting is not good. Don't you know that a little yeast works through the whole batch of dough? Is yeast a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I love cinnamon rolls. So
I do too.
I
I like almost everything I can think of that has yeast in it. Sounds great to me. Of course, I've been on like a
It
what?
smells good too.
I've been on like a low carb diet all the time, so like a loaf of bread is like, oh, bread. A roll. There's a roll on the table. I was at a training. I had to move the rolls to the other side of the table. I didn't touch them. I asked somebody else, would you please move those rolls over there? Right? Or the cinnamon rolls. What?
They do make a low carb bread.
Oh man, I don't know. I don't know if I could eat one of a low carb bread. But I felt the same way, Sarah. To me, yeast is something tasty. Okay? So one of the problems we have is that where we're reading the scripture, we think of our current day frame of reference. And so in this passage, this first verse, this is a big glaring, oh no, you don't want to be like yeast. Now let's think about why. In that day, it was hard to grow yeast. And remember, we did that, one time we actually Googled yeast and how they make yeast. Does anybody remember how they make it? And remember, they put stuff in there, especially sugar and water and sometimes milk, and then they let it rot a little while. And when it starts to bubble and churn, then that becomes the yeast. It's a growth. It's something that grows and bubbles up using sugar. And then what they do is they make it, and then they don't let it die. They keep that yeast going. There are sourdough starters that are many years old because they keep using a little piece of the old yeast and making new. So in essence, it's rotten sugar.
We had that go through the church about 5 or 10 years ago. I remember Janie had it. She passed it out to everybody.
Oh yeah.
We got some.
Friendship.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Friendship bread,
Yeah.
similar thing, right? Similar thing. So when we looked at it on Google, we Googled a bunch of different places that made yeast. And it's really very interesting if you want to do that little Google search, and it shows people and how they did it. And sometimes they're speaking a foreign language and you're just watching what they put into their little mix to make their starter. Now the Jews were under orders to clear all the yeast out of their house. And they had a time of year, was it every week before the Sabbath, or wasn't it? When they would have to clean all the yeast out, or was it just one year at the Feast of Unleavened Bread? Anyway, they had times when they had to remove all the yeast, and it was a symbolism of getting rid of the sin. Now, how would sin be like yeast?
Because it spreads throughout the world.
So if you have a little bit of yeast that you fermented, right? And you put it into a big bowl of flour and all that, and you're getting it ready to go, it grows throughout that whole loaf, right? And then you bake it up and kill it. And that's the structure of it, right? So is sin like that? Brianna says that's the way sin is. It spreads.
Yeah.
One little thing. You do one little thing, and pretty soon that one little thing is the focus of your life. It gets bigger and bigger. Whenever we allow a little sin in, it grows, doesn't it? It gets bigger and bigger in our lives. We keep thinking, oh, I'll just do this little thing and no one will know, and it'll just be this one time. Is that ever true? I can see on your faces it's not any more true for you than it is for me. It's not this one little time, is it? And pretty soon that one thing, even if you're able to just have that one exception, then you still make another exception later in the day, and then 3 times the next day, and by the end of the week I've eaten way too much, right? And everybody has their own thing. For me, it's learning controlling food. For you, it's whatever your thing is. We all have things that we struggle with because God is teaching us that self-control and teaching us how to take care of that. So we all have our thing. For me, that's what it is. Okay, so Brianna's right. It's just like yeast. Now take a look, please, in Matthew chapter 13.
Oh, we're going back to Matthew now. I was going to say the world is full of it.
Yeah?
Yeah, it is.
Matthew chapter 13, and we're going to stay there just a little bit. So Matthew 13. We're going to start at the beginning of Matthew chapter 13.
Matthew what?
13. Now, when the children of Israel left Egypt, they had to get rid of all leavened bread. Why? What would the symbolism be that when God took the children of Israel out of Egypt, they had to get rid of all yeast, all leavened bread?
Get rid of all the habits and the stuff they've acquired from Egypt.
They were in Egypt 400 years. 400 years. Do you think they absorbed some of that culture, some of those practices? They were probably doing them right alongside their Jewish practices, right? Their godly practices, not even realizing that they were off. Boy, that's not like us,
No.
right?
Not us.
We struggle with that too, right? So that was so when they came out of Egypt, God said, I want you to have a clean start. You don't bring anything with yeast in it. And that was the symbolism of sin, right? Let's look at Matthew chapter 13. This is Jesus. He's sitting out by the lake. He says, that same day Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore. Have any of you done that? Been by water and been able to hear someone speaking from the water onto the shore? It's funny how the voices carry, isn't it? So he's basically making a way for this large group of people to hear him. So he gives himself a little distance from them. He's on the water. They're on the sloping shore that's coming down to the water so they can hear him. And he says, he told them many things in parables. Now listen to the first parable. A farmer went out to sow his seed. Okay, just a moment. He's in a boat. He's on the water. They're on the shoreline, on the edge of the water, looking out, right up here. So he'd be like right over here. He's out here on the boat, and they're on this edge. Guess what they did all around this area? Farm. So while he's there and he's talking, he's looking out, and there's a farmer out there. And he starts saying this. He says, a farmer went out to sow his seed, and they're looking over there. Oh, yeah, look, there's a farmer out there sowing his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. He who has ears, let him hear. Okay. Are the birds good or bad? Go back and look at it. Birds good or bad? Look at your story.
They're a pain.
What's it say right here? Are they good or bad?
The birds,
For the farmer?
The birds.
Yeah.
the birds were good because the Lord provided seed for them.
They were good for the farmer's crop.
That's a good point, Bob. Okay, the birds are bad in the story. Let's see if that makes sense. Go back to page same chapter, verse 31. Wait. No, I'm sorry. Stay in chapter 13, but first go to verse 18. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means.
Right.
So that's the one he just told. So now Jesus is telling what it means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom of God and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. So what are the birds?
The evil.
Evil one. Do you think of birds as bad?
No, they're a pain.
I think of them as good. You know, I don't normally think of the birds as bad. Yes, Vern?
The farmers send guys around the field after they plant with shotguns, and then they have these, they hook these boom
Scare them away.
blasters
Yeah, I get the noise.
to scare the birds away.
Right.
They even hang on the, they hang sparkly stuff.
Right.
And they put
To scare 'em away.
in the field.
So if you were a farmer, you
The
might
birds
get
are
the
bad.
birds are bad, right? But do we get that? Usually we think of birds as good.
Right.
Let's look at an example of a place we often misunderstand because we think birds are good. Look at Measure 31. Same chapter. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all your seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and perch in its branches.
I like
Okay, wait a minute now. Birds good or bad? Bad, right? But now in this mustard seed one, don't we think of a garden and the lovely birds nesting in the mustard seed tree?
Then you look at your car and swear the birds.
This is a picture of the kingdom of heaven. Is it not true that when people come, when they become believers, and that seed sprouts, and then it spreads like fire, you get a lot of people coming, and then is it true that Satan has little inroads in? That there are little pockets of trouble, sometimes discord, sometimes little things that get off track? That's what this is talking about. That when the kingdom of God grows, when you grow like that, when more and more people come into your fellowship, you're going to have troubles. Troubles with people with wrong beliefs, wrong mindsets, things that are sins that have been a long time in their lives. And they're going to be working to change them and to grow. But meanwhile, you're going to have kind of little pockets of difficulty. Now, is it possible for us to have a church that everyone in it is perfectly holy and we all sit around and go, ooh, we love Jesus. We're all so perfect. I love that. Not as long as I'm here. Right. Any of us could say that, right? All of us struggle with things. So it is, of course, normal, natural, as the kingdom of God grows. We all bring ourselves to the kingdom. And none of us is 100%. We're all struggling with different things, and we encourage and we develop one another. So, birds good or birds bad? Birds bad. They're a symbol of Satan coming and sitting, nesting in that growing, that spreading, growing mustard seed. The little seed, one person's faith, gets spread to another person, catches like wildfire, grows into a big bushy. If you've ever seen mustard plants, they're kind of a yellowish look and they grow like a big bush. You leave them long enough, they'll become tree-like, they get big. And they spread across the land. So a mustard seed field looks like a huge mass of yellow bush.
Is that what they're called, mustard seed?
Yeah. And so that's where they take the seed off of that bush, Brianna. They mash it and they make mustard, yellow mustard. And so that's mustard seed bush that can become a tree. So the kingdom of God is like that, in that our church can grow and spread, our faith grows and spread. A lot of people come together, but when you get a lot of people together, you're going to have little bits of trouble. Now, Paul is talking to the Corinthians. He was there for 18 months, did we say? And then he left. And now he's writing back because they're having problems. Why are they having problems? None of them have been Christians for more than 3 years. And they have a church that's growing in the middle of the town that celebrates the temple Aphrodite. Right? 2 seaport town with the temple of Aphrodite right there up on the top hill. So Paul is talking to them about things that they need to get under control. And this is an example, just like yeast, where we have in mind that somehow yeast is kind of a good thing, but we need to understand that according to Jewish culture, yeast is a bad thing. It represents sin that spreads throughout. And we do the same thing with birds. Birds are a nice thing. Well, not if they represent Satan. Then it's a bad thing. Eve?
For some reason, whoever's class I was in, I guess, I didn't come up with it myself. So in the scripture it says, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. I wrote the word unbelievers with an arrow to birds.
There you go. It's the idea that as unbelievers, as people come and they're part of the church, you get some that are not sincere. That's Satan's inroad, that's how he comes in, becomes a part. So yeah, that's that same concept. Mm-hmm. So we have to just remember that we're not creating a monastery. This is not a monastery, it's a family. Mm-hmm. So when you have a family, like I said to Billy this morning, you have your odd uncle like Charles who leaves his pants open when he stops at Gila Bend, right? Yeah. We all have strangeness about us, different things. We come together as a family. Okay, look at the same chapter, Matthew 13. Look at verse 33. he told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into a large amount of flour until it worked all through the dough. Notice that verse is directly following the section on the birds landing in the mustard seed. See that? It's the same concept.
Yeah.
So the yeast, the birds, it's the same idea that as you grow, you're going to get these birds of the air that come and nest. As you grow, it's like yeast. It goes through the whole dough. So we're going to have, this is going to be a problem, and that's what Paul is talking about, is this problem. So when we look in 1 Corinthians, we're seeing his instruction to a group of people that are struggling with this problem. What's okay and what's not okay? We don't have the law anymore. We're not Jews. Some of us are Jews, some are not. So what is it that we have to do? Is it okay to wear flashy jewelry or not? All these questions that we read have to do with what is acceptable and not acceptable to God. So now we're back in 1 Corinthians 5, verse 6.
You were on 5, didn't you?
We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6.
Oh.
Your boasting is not good. So what is the yeast in verse 6? Boasting. Boasting is the target sin that Paul is pointing out is like the yeast. They know yeast represents sin or bad, something that spreads throughout. And Paul targets boasting. Now, of all the things you could target, why did he target boasting? Why boasting, Vern?
It's pride.
Pride.
It's pride.
Pride.
Cometh before the fall.
Pride cometh before the fall.
Well, it's my way or no way, you know. But when you surrender, it's not your way. It's surrender.
It's surrendering. So boasting, isn't it interesting? Of all the things he could pick, we're going to see later that they had all kinds of sexual weird stuff going on, right? All kinds of. He's talked already about a couple problems that they had, but the one thing he picks to represent the yeast is the boasting. Now, we talked before in the earlier chapters about how people were saying, well, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. Can you see how Paul is saying the root of that is the boasting? You know, well, Eve taught me, so step back. Right?
Yeah, really.
I'm under Judy's tutelage. Right? You name whoever it is you get the lesson from, and somehow that gives you some sort of prestige. So, right, boasting. Now, will pride, boasting, pride, will that lead to other problems?
Yes.
Why can't I marry my father's wife and come to church and be a leader? And why don't you too? Who cares? It doesn't matter. Why can't I go during the week and celebrate the festivals of Aphrodite as long as I come to church with a pure heart?
But I was tutored under Paul, so it's okay for me to marry my father's.
Which is exactly what Paul addresses. Excellent. Because Paul says, look at this, right? It's a quote. Oh, look on chapter 7. We're going to see it. It says, chapter 6, look at verse 12. See, do you see quotation marks there, Sarah? I didn't know this until today. See, on chapter 6, verse 12, see the quotation marks?
I don't have quotation marks.
Oh, you
Mine's
don't?
New King James.
Okay. The quotation marks are on everything is permissible for me, end quote. That's what Paul said to them. But of course, they took it completely out of context. And so then he makes it clear to them what the context was of him saying that. That's why many translations put it in quotes. So you're exactly right, Sarah. Back over here, when they say, I can do this because I was taught by Paul, and Paul says everything is acceptable. Everything is permissible for me. We're not under the law anymore, right? So that very thing is what Paul is trying to straighten out with them. is they've taken his saying and gone off. Now, if you are being boastful or proud, would that be an easy way to get into trouble? Because you're not being submissive or humble, right? You're not allowing to think about, well, wait a minute, is this really right? Yes, Paul said all things are permissible, but what was he referring? When you're proud, you're just looking for proof that it's okay, right? Brianna?
Like when you win, let's say, a softball game.
Right.
And your team gets really proud and boastful and really prideful, and like they don't consider the other team's feelings.
That's important, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you, Brianna. That is very important. That is another way that we get prideful and we can be boastful. Is it okay to feel good that we won?
Yeah.
Is it okay to feel good that we've accomplished something?
Sure.
I felt really good about when I was at my training. They didn't have the proper breakfast for me, and I had planned ahead. I went to the store and I had spinach and I had an apple, which was okay, but I needed a protein. And when I went to go have the breakfast, it was a continental breakfast. So they only had sweet rolls and the wrong fruit. They had pineapple, and I was supposed to only have like an apple or berries. So I had my apple. I had brought it, packed it with me. I had put a little baggie of spinach in my pack, so I was ready for that. But I didn't have a protein, so I went to the restaurant. And I got 2 scrambled eggs, a dry with pepper. So I had my protein. I felt really good about that until later on when I had a sweet roll. But I was doing good. I felt good. I felt good about it, and I told myself, "Look, this is great." But the problem is that I gave myself permission to then mess it up later on because I did good. Look, I did. I got my breakfast right. Don't laugh. I know why you're laughing, because it happens to you, right? Oh my goodness. Just this one thing. Well, anyway. Okay, so yes, boasting and being prideful is a sin. Now, there's nothing wrong with enjoying our accomplishments and feeling good about it, but it's when we begin to use it to give ourselves permission to do the things we shouldn't do, to lose self-control. And when we're not thinking of other people, like Brianna said, the other people that we're doing something with.
That had lost.
Yeah, that are competing. Yes.
They're really like bummed out.
Sure.
Or, like, let's say you win the game, right? And the other team, you know how both the teams get together and they shake hands?
Yeah.
I think there's a reason for that.
Yeah. To kind of make that connection again. And don't you think also when someone has a special talent, like I know that you have a really good voice, don't you think that sometimes when someone has a special talent or gift, it can be easy for people to feel like they're too good for them or because they do something better? And it can also be easy if you're the person who has a good voice to be boastful or proud about that, right? So things like that are kind of tricky too. Vern?
Well, I think I've been part of different groups, and it's easy to feel a little bit morally superior to your brothers and sisters. You guys may think you're morally superior, but you're not.
You are? On my part, I'm bragging.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're boasting, I'm bragging. Okay, you guys understand this, so we will move on. Verse 7. Get rid of the old yeast, Vern, that you may be a new batch without yeast, as you really are. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival not with the old yeast, the yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. Did he say perfection?
No.
Sincerity.
You try hard.
You're working on it. You're being transparent. You know what you struggle with, and you're working on it. You're sincere about it. You're not faking it. If you want this, I always say, fake it till you make it. But what I'm really talking about is called approximation. Whenever we learn something, we learn it by approximating it. So my little grandbabies, You should have heard Annabelle talking this week. I don't know what she said, but it was something. It was very precise. And Heather can pick out words that she's saying, but they add kind of weird pronunciations to the front and end, so I can't really pick them. But she will, and she uses hand gestures. And she just her eyes, and she's, and she'll tell you something very meaningful. She'll go, so there, and I will say, is that right? Right? It's very meaningful. We posted one of the pictures on Facebook. She's making this weird little face. It's those kind of faces she makes. You don't know what she's saying, but it's interesting. So she's what's called approximating. That's approximation. You put it out there, you try it, and then with time they refine, they'll hear more, understand more of what's being said, and they began to get closer and closer. We all learn that way. That's how we learn to read. That's how we learn to do math, science, subject areas. We approximate, and then we get closer and closer. We refine it and add to it. So here in what Christ is talking about, Paul's talking about here, is but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. So we're being honest about where we are. We're sincere in our efforts to make improvements on how we're behaving and what we're doing, and not allowing that yeast to have a foothold in us again. And we all do that together. Together we are sincere and truthful. Now, Vern, I don't mind. I don't think you mind if I ask, but I know one time I attended a meeting for Overeaters Anonymous, and one of the things they talked about was being truthful with yourself, and how you have to be honest with what you are and are not doing. Is that one of the things?
Honesty goes a long way. Honesty, open-mindedness, and willingness is how you do it.
And Paul is using the words sincerity and truth to describe those three words. So do we see the concept there? Sincerity and truth. So if we feel imperfect, I would think those could be two words that we could hold on to when we feel imperfect. When we feel like there's something we're struggling with, what if we could come back to being sincere and truthful? Wouldn't that get us a long way?
Well, Paul talked about it in another place, and he talked about a guy looking in the mirror, and then when he turns away, he forgets what he looks like. But if you can see yourself in the mirror and remember who you are, and just really truthfully see yourself, you can improve.
Okay, so then back up here, what you said, I absolutely agree with. Look back up here where Paul says at the end of verse 7, get rid of the old yeast that you may be a new batch without yeast as you really are. Isn't that the problem? Satan is the accuser. What does Satan always do?
You're a sinner. You're horrible.
Reminds us of everything we ever did wrong. So out of my whole trip to my training that I went to, where was that? In Flagstaff at Little America. I was there Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. I think twice I ate something I shouldn't have eaten. But I didn't overdo it. I just ate a little more than I should have. But I've been kicking myself every day since then for those two things. Instead of saying, Laura, look how you stick with your plan for your breakfast, your lunch. Instead of focusing on the things that I was able to accomplish, all that plagues me is the reminder of the 2 times when I ate what I shouldn't have eaten. So that's where Satan comes in. He will remind you of every little fault and every little flaw. Why does Satan do that? Why does the accuser choose to remind us of the negative pieces? Because it's not true. Those 2 little things will make me focus on the untruth that I'm always eating the wrong stuff. If I was always eating the wrong stuff, I wouldn't be in the shape I'm in now. I'd be in the shape I was of several years ago. Right? But Satan's going to remind us of every little mistake so that grows.
So give up.
So if we would remind ourselves of the truth and be sincere, then we could grow the things that are going well, that are going right. We could be a dough without yeast in it. So if we can remind ourselves about sincerity and truth and not fall prey to the accuser.
And we need to remind him of his future.
Yes. Look right here. as you really are, for Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. The sacrifice has been made. We are forgiven. We need to accept that forgiveness and try it again. Keep working at it. Okay, look at verse 9. I've written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral or greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is sexually immoral or greedy or an idolater or a slanderer, a drunkard or a swindler. With such a man, do not even eat. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked man from among you. Now, what's he talking about here?
Non-believers. Believers and non-believers. Like, we're to hold them accountable.
Yeah, we're not to judge them.
Well, how do we, if we're supposed to expel people who are immoral or living immoral from among us, but we're not supposed to reject people who are immoral in the world. So how do we do that without judging?
No, it didn't say we don't have to judge. It says we judge our brothers. We don't judge the world, just our brothers.
Well, what do we do about our brothers? If we have a brother that is doing something that we all know is wrong, immoral, sexual immorality is the big thing they were struggling with. For example, going to the Aphrodite temple during the week and then coming to worship on Sunday or Saturday, whatever day they worshiped, and bringing their one time this person, one time that person, bringing people with them, and saying and acting like it's no big deal.
Quietly tell them.
There's a way to go about it, right? There's a whole process to do it in a respectful way. But basically, Paul is saying you need to discipline those within your family. Now, I have members of my family that are not all right. I would say right. So what do? There are certain behaviors that I will not accept in my house at my family gatherings, period. I'm mom. It's my house. You're going to come to my house. There are certain things they know that are going to be the parameters. That's the way it is. That's the way it is at my house. Now, they might do something somewhere else whenever they're having their own choices, but they're not doing it in front of me, and they're not doing it at my house. Do I have the right? Am I judging them? Yes. I'm saying, don't do that. That's not right. I don't want to hear. You choose to do that. That's your thing over there, but you don't do it here in my house. Can we set limits and boundaries on what occurs in the house of God?
Yes.
There are boundaries. And Paul's going to talk more about this in chapters 6 and 7 about how to do this with your brothers. But we do have to set some boundaries, don't we? We have to. Because it's not about someone who's a sinner coming to church and feeling rejected. We don't want to reject people because they're sinners. We're all sinners.
But they're not part of the family. They are not part of the church. They are unbelievers that are interested. The part of the church that he's talking about, I think, is the believers that have been baptized and accepted Jesus.
He says it exactly there.
Right.
He says, I'm not talking about the world. If I told you to not associate with anyone in the world, you'd have to leave the world.
That's right.
That's what he says, because it's all around you, right? So it's not about that. He says, but in your fellowship, in your church, when you gather together, you should not be having people in positions of leadership or in big positions where it looks like you're accepting their sin, right? So an example, remember the example he gave before was the person who was coming to church. It doesn't even say they were married, or they're just coming to church with their father's wife. So like probably a stepmother. Now he's saying that doesn't even happen, and the pagans don't even do that. But you're allowing this to occur. That person needs to go out. And remember he said, why does the person need to go out? So that he'll know it's wrong. That person doesn't know it's wrong. When people come to us knowing that their life is wrong, knowing they've got this problem or that problem, we lovingly love one another and we help each other in sincerity and truth to start working toward fixing some of those problems and allowing Christ to do his work of forgiveness from inside. Right? We don't reject people because they're sinners, but we also can't receive that sin into our worship and allow it to exist, because what will happen? It will grow like yeast. Now we're going to have the birds of the air come and land in our fellowship. We have an open service where we invite people to come. We're going to have all kinds of birds. They're going to come and land in our bushes, right? And we're going to be trying to help win those people to Christ so that they are no longer birds in the bushes. We're hoping that they will come to a saving knowledge of Christ. But we're also not going to allow someone who's flagrantly sinning to spread like yeast, right? And that is very tricky. Now, we're going to read more about that in 1 Corinthians. He's going to talk about how to do that in chapter 6, because you'll see chapter 6, you see the heading? What's it say? So Paul, he's got like from one side to the other. From one side, they're letting everybody come in and just do anything. On the other side, whenever some little squabble comes up, they're filing a lawsuit with each other and going out into the courts to file a lawsuit. And so he's going to use those two examples to then talk about how do we judge. We're not really judging people. What we're doing is we're protecting the family against sin, making sure everyone knows what sin is and helping people to come to a saving knowledge. So Paul's going to give instruction. This part is people who just can do anything willy-nilly and look like they're accepted into, and they're a part of the church, and it's fine to do that, act that way. And then he's going to talk about how every little thing you take somebody to court for, and how you should be just deciding that yourselves. So he's going to bring that around and talk about how to manage this problem with people in the church. Okay? Any comments before I turn us off of Facebook Live?
Well, you're giving the example about, you know what, it's your house, so you follow the rules of my house when you come to my house. When you're going to follow their rules when you go to their house. I wouldn't classify that as being judgmental.
I wouldn't either. And would you classify it as hypocrisy for the person to respect my house? Is that hypocrisy?
No.
I don't think so either. I think it's respect. And can't we demand that of the house of God? Couldn't we say to someone, we realize that that this is something that you're struggling with, but you can't bring your whiskey with you to church? We could, because then we're making sure they understand that we consider that to be inappropriate behavior and not good for them. Do you see what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I agree with you. Mm-hmm. And we think of judging as a bad thing, but like Sarah said, and what Paul's going to describe is, he's saying, why aren't you making some decisions about this? You can use the term judging, but it's not like a holier than thou. Oh, Bob, you just blah, 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 blah. You know, it's not like that, like judging like that. It's like coming alongside someone and saying, this is a sinful thing. This is something that that is not right in God's eyes, just so you know. Let me show you in the scripture, how can I help you with this? Usually people already know. And for me, my experience has been that people who don't know their sin, it's usually because there's another sin they've been working so hard on, they haven't yet recognized the second or the third or the fourth thing. And that's okay too. We all have to kind of prioritize, and we start one place and God works us through, right? So, okay, so we're not meeting next week because of the VBS prayer walk. But then when we get back the following week, then we'll go to chapter 6, 1 Corinthians 6. Okay? Thank you, everybody. Good morning. Oh, Greg is watching. Good to see you, Greg. Hope you guys are having safe travels.
Well, they're traveling now.
Yep. Okay.